Okay, Panthers. So here we go. Today, we're going to look at the beginning of the progressive movement. And this really is like late 1800s into the early 1900s. And it's in response to the period of industrialization that the United States goes through. So while we're going through industrialization, we're having all these factories and everything pop up during this time. Um, we experience a lot of growing pains. Workers are being used and abused and exploited. We have a lot of immigrants coming in at this time, and people really don't like the immigrants, and there's a lot of discrimination against the immigrants. We have a lot of child labor taking place. Crowding in the cities. The cities are becoming more and more and more crowded, and that's leading to all sorts of other issues. Now, this is not a problem that's unique to the United States. Every country that's gone through industrialization has experienced kind of these same growing pains. Europe, England, and France and Germany all experienced very, very similar things when they went through their industrial revolution in the mid 1800s. And then it happens to the United States in the late 1800s. And it's a phenomenon that takes place. All these places had very similar experiences. Currently, India and China are going through the exact same processes that we went through 100 years ago. The difference is, in Europe and in the United States, we responded and we tried to address and fix these problems. Other places around the world, say Russia in the early 1900s, Russia didn't address these problems, and it led to the Russian Revolution and the rise of communism in Russia because the government there just didn't address these similar problems. The United States and England, especially, they addressed these problems and avoided a lot of these issues. So that's what we're going to look at today. A lot of things happen. There's a lot of reforms that take place during this time. So we're going to talk about a lot of different things here. All right. So away we go. One of the very first problems that's going to be addressed, one of the biggest problems going to be addressed, is the crowding that takes place in the cities during this time. And there's a number of different reasons why the crowding in the cities begin to take place. More and more people are moving to the cities than ever before. Around this time, for the first time, there will be more people living in urban areas and in cities than will be living in rural areas out in the country, farmers and so on. For the first time, we see that transformation take place. So there's just a crush of people coming in, and they're coming here for jobs in the factories, as well as all of the immigrants who are coming from Europe during this time, the period of immigration. And it's just leading to this really overcrowding problems, filth and disease and crushing poverty, just horrible, horrible conditions. Now, most Americans really are not aware of how bad it truly is in what would be called the slums or in the ghettos or the very, very poor areas of their cities. And it's not until there's a book published by a journalist by the name of Jacob Riis, and he publishes this book called How the Other Half Lives. Now, Jacob Riis goes and lives in these just horrific places and writes about what happened, what life is like there. He goes and lives there for an entire year, and he takes these photographs. Some of the photographs you see here are from that book, and he writes about what it's like there, what it's like to live there, and then he has these photographs that go along with it. Now, after this book is published, there's this huge outcry from American citizens who go, this is not right. People should not be living like this in one of the wealthiest, one of the most prosperous countries in the world. We should not have people living like this. And so there's some changes that are made. The government responds to these complaints. One of the things that they do is that government shrinks the plots of land on which these lower income housing units could be built. Okay? So the idea is if they have smaller plots of land to build these tenements, these lower income housing units, then fewer people will live there, which means less disease and less filth and less problems there. So what developers begin to do is, instead of building out sideways because they have a big plot of land, now because they have a smaller plot of land, instead of building out, they begin to build up and just build higher tenements that go up instead of out. And so they begin to get the same amount of people. Mm-hmm. Another change is that all apartments must have an outside window. Most of the tenements at this time did not have an outside window. I shouldn't say most, but a lot of them. They were interior rooms, so there was no airflow coming through there. And during this time, there's no organized trash pickup anywhere. That's another change that comes out of this time is organized trash pickup, where you put your trash out on a Monday and they come pick it up Tuesday morning or whatever. At that time, they don't have that. So people were just dumping trash and rotting food and whatever out in the hallways. And so you get this stench of rotting trash, and it comes into your apartment. And if you don't have any windows, you have no escape from that. You have no fresh air coming in. One of the biggest changes here that comes out of this is that you have to have a flushing toilet. This is one of the biggest advancements that take place during this time is the flushing toilet. It's a huge, huge change, because prior to this, you'd have to go outside, to an outhouse if you lived out in the country. In the cities, they really don't have that access to an outhouse. So they would go to what were known as communal privies. And they were like porta potties. And coming out of the back of the porta potty was like a gutter that they called an open sewer. And so when you did your thing in the privy there, it would flow out this open gutter out the back, and it would flow into a larger gutter that went down the alleyway called another open sewer. And so you had raw sewage floating down the open sewer there. And where the large open sewer would empty into was the river, the local river. And the local river is where most of these people would go. A lot of these people would go to get their cooking and their cleaning and their drinking water. Right? So, and then very often these open sewers, because they were in older parts, kind of rundown, poorer parts of the city, the city didn't maintain them very well, so they got broken. They would, tiles would get broken, or they'd get clogged up with trash. Well, this raw sewage has got to go somewhere. And where it would go, it'd begin to back up, and it would back up into the tenement. So very often, if you lived on the ground floor of one of these tenements, it was not unusual that you were literally living in raw sewage. Isn't that so nasty? So indoor plumbing comes along, the flush toilet comes along, and city governments begin to say, in addition to smaller plots of land and all apartments must have a window, all buildings must have at least one flushing toilet in it. And that dramatically improves the mortality rates in these tenements. Dramatically get better. People begin to live longer, and they begin to live healthier as a result of that. Also, they have organized trash pickup, so you don't have the trash. You can see in the photograph on the left there's a lot of trash because there was just nobody coming by to pick it up. Wealthier parts of the city and even in the country, they would burn their trash. In the inner part of the cities, in the poorer parts, where the slums are, they didn't have that luxury. So the trash would just build up and build up and build up, and that brings rats and disease and all sorts of things. So cities began to organize regular trash pickups every week. So that was one of the big changes that comes about. There's another book that dramatically impacts American lives. And this one is about what we ate. In 1906, there's another book that's published that calls America's attention to another very big problem in the cities, and that was meatpacking plants. Meatpacking plants were filthy, awful, awful places. A journalist by the name of Upton Sinclair writes a book called The Jungle. And Upton Sinclair, kind of like Jacob Riis, Upton Sinclair goes and gets a job in these meatpacking plants in Chicago. And he writes this book about his experiences. Now, the book is kind of a fictional, non-fictional, because he makes up characters. There's characters that are not real people in the book. They're amalgamations of all these people that he met. Mostly immigrants worked in these factories. So the characters in his book were just a bunch of these people that he met, and then he just combined them all into one character. So their experiences are real. The things he writes about are real, things that he saw, things that he experienced in these meatpacking plants. He brings attention to these unbelievably horrific conditions in these meatpacking plants. There was a lot of times the meat was stored in just room temperature. They weren't refrigerated. So the meat began to rot before it was even processed. And what meatpacking plants would do, right? Because nobody's going to buy like a green piece of steak, right? If the steak looks a little green, you go, no. So what meatpacking plants begin to do is they would have their employees inject red dye into the meat so it would look red again. They'd be grinding up hamburger, and there were very unsafe working conditions. And it wasn't unusual for somebody to get their hand or their arm cut in a grinder, and their hand or arm get ground up with the hamburger. And the meatpacking plant say, it's all good, right? Meat is meat. People don't know if they're eating cow meat or human meat. Send it out. Rats very often would fall into the grinders, and they would grind up rats with the hamburger. And so people were eating that. Rats would run through all these places where they'd keep the meat. So they would go in to get the meat, get down a thing of meat to get it processed. And they'd have to swipe off several layers of rat dung, rat poop off of the meat. Rats had been eating on the meat, and they would just continue to process it. It was just horrific conditions. Okay. Now, Upton Sinclair is a communist. His hope was that people would read this book and they would be so shocked and so horrified at the conditions that they would stage this revolution and they would overthrow the American government because it wasn't protecting them. Like we discussed earlier, one of the reasons why this doesn't happen, the government responds. Why did it happen in Russia? The government didn't respond to these problems. The United States, we responded. And the United States government goes, yeah, this is a real problem. And so laws were passed to address these issues. And so in 1906, then President Teddy Roosevelt, who is, you can see in the right here, that's President Teddy Roosevelt in the political cartoon, right? And here's the meat scandal, and he's digging through the meat scandal. 1906, Food and Drug Act is passed by Teddy Roosevelt. And what this was a law, and it's still around today, designed to make sure that the food and the medicine that are sold are safe. They're not going to kill you, right? Like, you're not going to get rotted meat. You can be rest assured the hamburger that you're eating is actually hamburger and not somebody's hand. So that's passed. The medicine was a huge problem back then. You can see, cocaine toothache drops, instantaneous cure. Well, yeah. There were pills that were made out of cocaine to help you if you had a toothache. There were people that traveled a country that sold all sorts of potions and medicine, claiming to cure cancer, to cure diabetes, to cure all sorts of different ailments. One of the most famous examples to come out of this, there was a company that sold pills that swore they were magical weight loss pills. You would take these and your weight would automatically drop off. You didn't need to exercise, didn't need to watch what you ate. You could eat whatever you wanted. You could do whatever you wanted. You were going to lose weight. And people bought these pills. The pills worked. People magically began dropping weight. They could eat whatever they wanted. They were going to lose weight. They could eat as much as they wanted. They were going to lose weight. They could sit around all day and barely move, and they would lose weight. They were truly magical pills. Problem was, they would never stop losing pills or stop losing weight, because these pills were actually tapeworms that they were eating, that they would take. And so they would take these pills with these tapeworms, and these tapeworms would then attach themselves to their intestines. And the tapeworms were literally eating the people from the inside out. Right? So this law mandates that food has to be handled in a way that is not going to be contaminated. It has to be stored in refrigerated, in some sort of refrigeration. It begins to list. You have to list the ingredients. If you buy any food on a box or on the can, on the back it'll tell you exactly what's in there. And foods couldn't be spoiled or rotten. If you buy meat that says USDA on it, right, that's from this law. It's a government inspection stamp that says, yep, this meat is okay to eat. Okay, medicine that would have been sold had to be safe, has to be proven that it's effective, and it would do what it was advertised to do, right? You can't be eating cocaine pills. That's not safe. There's not a drug out there that's going to cure cancer. That's not true, right? So this protects all of that. Right now, we're going through the vaccine to find a cure for the Rona, right? All of that is controlled by the Food and Drug Act. All these vaccines have to go through a government agency, and the government agency has to look at these vaccines and determine, yeah, they're doing what they're supposed to do. They're not going to, hurt people. The cure can't be worse than the disease, and that is all controlled by this law here. All right, next up that we're going to deal with is immigrants. Immigrants are just pouring into the country, and they have a real hard time fitting in, right? Immigrants always have a hard time fitting in because they tend to stand out. Immigrants, especially back then, they looked different. They dressed very different than Americans did. They certainly sounded different than Americans did. And they have a hard time interacting and being a part of American society, right? Still today, first generation immigrants, people who've come to America, they're the ones who originally come to America. They have a very hard time kind of fitting into American society. However, their kids who grew up in America will fit in much better because they've been surrounded by this culture. So their kids will be much more, quote unquote, American than their parents were. That's true today, and it was even more true back then. Jane Addams, the lady you see here, she comes up with this idea of settlement houses. And settlement houses were put into high immigrant neighborhoods to help them, one, find a job, and then teach them how to be Americans, to Americanize them. Now, the idea originally comes from England, right? And she saw it being used in England. She goes, gosh, this would be a great thing in the United States because we have so many immigrants. So she begins to develop these settlement houses. And they would teach immigrants English, how to read English, how to write English, how to speak English. She would teach them American customs and American culture. Um, like eating utensils. A lot of these people really had never used eating utensils and didn't know how to eat like an American, how to live like an American. American holidays. She would help them find jobs. Now, the first settlement house is called the Hull House, and it was in Chicago. And there's a picture of the Hull House. It's still there today. It's now a museum, but that's what the Hull House looked like. And it was a place where immigrants could go and learn how to be an American, right? They would teach them English, how to dress like an American, how to eat like an American, American customs, American holidays, help them find jobs. And then ultimately, it offered citizenship classes for them to pass the citizenship test. So this was a progressive reform intended to help immigrants fit into American society because there was just a crush of immigrants coming in, and there was a lot of discrimination against them because they looked different, acted different, sounded different, so on and so forth. Another issue that's addressed during this time is child labor. Child labor during this time is finally outlawed. There's a series of child labor laws that are passed that raises the minimum age for employment, from 12 to 16 years old. You have to be at least 12 years old to get a job, and then up to 16, depending on what the job is, depending on how dangerous the job is, and so on and so forth, right? But the youngest you could get a job was 12. Prior to this, there was no age requirement. And for a lot of families, as soon as a child knew how to walk and talk, it was assumed they were going to go get a job. Okay. Now, they passed this law. It's not right to have, 7-year-olds working in a mine for 14, 15 hours a day, and so on and so forth. However, many parents did not support this law, because they needed these kids to work for them to get by. They depended on their children having a job. And many parents would tell their kids to lie about their age so they could get a job because they just couldn't get by without that. There's a number of laws that are passed during this time that limit the amount of hours an employee could work. No longer could you work, theoretically, unlimited amount of hours. Now you're going to only be allowed to work. At first it was 12 and then it was 10. Then eventually it comes down to 8 hours a day. We get the 40-hour work week to come out of this. And a lot of these laws are passed because of employees begin to join unions, who are, organizations that are working, and they were fighting to get rid of child labor laws. They were working for less hours worked and more pay. And during this time, because of the rapid growth of membership of unions, a number of these laws begin to get passed, but also worker pay and benefits also begin to increase dramatically during this time. However, employers don't like all these changes because it cuts into their bottom line. Following the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, where workers went on strike to protest the cutting of wages, following the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, workers begin to realize they've got power as well. In order for the boss man, in order for the company to make money, the workers have to work. So there's this symbiotic relationship, right? In order for the workers to get paid, there's got to be a company. In order for the company to make money, there's got to be workers. So workers begin to organize themselves into unions, and they're working and they're fighting to get rid of child labor, the lower wages or the lower hours, increase wages. Okay. Fewer hours, better working conditions, better pay. Okay. They meet with varying degrees of success. Some workers are successful. They're able to get 8 hours, of work and so on. Employers don't like unions. They don't like the workers telling them what to do. And employers begin to fight against unions. And they would hire organizations to stop workers from joining a union and then to an attempt to get rid of unions. The most famous of these organizations was a detective agency called the Pinkertons. Now, the Pinkertons were a legitimate detective agency. They come out of the Civil War. They do a lot of work in the Civil War, getting rid of spies and foreign agents and things like that during the Civil War. The Pinkertons then become an anti-union organization, and they would get hired by people like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller to go out and get rid of unions. And the Pinkertons become a paramilitary force. In 1890, the Pinkertons will have more guns, more weapons than the United States Army had. They were better equipped militarily, the Pinkertons were, than the United States military. Oof. And the Pinkertons would get rid of unions. They would break unions through intimidation. They would find the union leaders and they would just beat the bejesus out of them in broad daylight. They would just beat them down with bats. If there was a strike taking place, it was very, very often the Pinkertons would come in and with guns ablazing and just shoot the place up. Okay. So as a result of the workers trying to organize and their employers fighting against them with Pinkertons and stuff, there becomes this increased tension. And late 1800s, early 1900s, there's some very, very violent labor clashes. The Haymarket strike in Chicago, which you guys did the internet search on, right? That's one of the very first really violent strikes. The Homestead strike in Pennsylvania in 1892, when workers went on strike and they closed down one of Carnegie's steel mills, and Carnegie brought in the Pinkertons and shot the place up. It was a very violent clash. And then the Ledlow strike in Ledlow, Colorado in 1914, which was a mine owned by John D. Rockefeller. And John D. Rockefeller hires the Pinkertons, and they came in and they set the tent colony of the workers on fire, and they opened fire with a machine gun and killed not only the workers, but women and children as well in this. And most of these workers were Greek immigrants. So it was just incredibly violent time during labor, the rise of labor. Another area that's going to be addressed during this progressive time is education. Okay. There's no compulsory education laws really at this time, meaning that you're required to go to school. So most students, most people back then went to school maybe a couple of years, maybe get enough to read and write, although not well, but they would maybe have that skill. And then they were gone. They would go off and work in the farm, and they go work in the factory. Well, now that they're passing child labor laws, right, that kids can't go get a job until a certain age, we've got to do something with these kids, right? We just can't have them wandering the streets. So they begin to pass compulsory education laws. And you have to go to school until you're 14. And now, obviously, those laws have been extended out. The guy who really drives these is John Dewey, and that's who you see in his picture there. School year is made longer, okay? But, the school year used to be very, very short before this. School year is now going to be longer. It's going to be about 9 months, but it still allows for the reality of life in a lot of America that still exists today. There's still a remnant of this today. Summer vacation. And summer vacation happens because a lot of the students would have to go home and work on the farm and help their family farm. This is the time of planting, and you're getting the fields ready. And that's when children were really needed a lot in agrarian work. So they would be gone during the summer, and then they'd come back early fall. And our school calendar still looks that way, although there's a lot of really serious discussion about just getting rid of summer vacation and going to kind of an all year-round school. Because, I mean, how many of you guys are going home to work on the farm in June and July? Probably not a lot of you, right? And so they're saying this is just an old holdover from the past that's really not needed anymore. John Dewey, the guy you see in the picture there, he's the one that really pushes a lot of these reforms, and he transforms what education is in America. John Dewey said, school should teach skills that are going to be needed in life, that real, actual skills that students will need. Prior to this, education was about, you'd learn things like Latin and Greek, and you'd read the classic, these classic pieces of literature, and it's called a classical education. And John Dewey said, that's dumb. Why are we doing that? Why are we teaching kids Latin? Where are they going to go? Who are they going to go talk to? Right? There's nobody out there to talk to in Latin. You don't go to Latin land. There's nobody out there. He said, we need to teach kids how to do actual things, how to read, how to write, how to do at least basic math, right? So they can be productive members of society, okay? As well as good workers, having skills that companies want. So he transforms American education. Now, with compulsory education laws, right, kids are required to go to school longer, and this crush of new immigrants coming into the country, we're going to need more schools, right? A lot more schools. In 1870, right after the Civil War is over, 1870, there's 500 high schools across the United States. In the entire country, there's 500 high schools. Then we pass compulsory education laws. We get into the age of immigration, and there's this all of a sudden explosion of schools. By 1910, 40 years later, there's over 10,000 high schools. And in the photograph here that you see, this is a school that was built in 1899. You guys all know where this school is. You've seen it, I'm sure, many times. You just don't know that you know it. So this is the first school in Arvada. It was called Arvada School. It was a K through 12 school. It was a one-room schoolhouse. This school, this building, is still there today. This is in Old Town Arvada, and it is now part of the present-day Schoolhouse restaurant. That's why it's called the Schoolhouse, because this was the location of the first school. This building here is the present-day bar. And if you go through Old Town Arvada, look at this. This doorway is still there. That's still the doorway into the bar. And there's this stone plaque up there. It says Arvada School, and it says 1899, I think is what it says on there. That plaque is still there. Oh! How cool is that? All right. Another reform that these reformers, progressives, really focus on is alcohol. For a long time, there had been an anti-alcohol reform element in the United States, going all the way back to the early 1800s, who want, for various reasons, to get rid of alcohol, outlaw alcohol. These groups who had been fighting for maybe a century for this finally get their realization in 1919 when the 18th Amendment is passed, which outlaws the production, the sale, the consumption, possession of alcohol. Now, it was hoped, there was many different groups that were involved in this. There were religious groups who believed that if we got rid of alcohol, we'd have a more Christian, moral nation, right? That if we got rid of alcohol, instead of sleeping off Saturday night, you would be spending Sunday morning in the church. There were social reformers who believed that if we got rid of alcohol, people would stop breaking the law, because it's pretty obvious. The only people that break the law are drunk people, We'd have better workers. There were labor reform leaders and also factory owners who wanted to get rid of alcohol because they'd have better workers, right? It's tough to work when you're drunk. And we'd have less immigrants because if we get rid of alcohol, then German and Irish immigrants who have this, stereotype that they're all drinkers, they won't come to the United States because they won't be able to drink. So we won't get all these immigrants. Right? There were women's groups that were very in favor of this. You can see in the picture there, it's all women. Women believe we get rid of alcohol, we'll have better husbands, better sons, better brothers. So there was many groups involved in pushing for this, and they eventually get it with the 18th Amendment. Now, that's a total failure, right? In fact, crime tends to go up more after this because people who were drinking prior to the 18th Amendment, they're going to continue to drink. And now they're breaking the law. And a lot of people figure, I'm already breaking the law, might as well go all the way. So it's a complete and total failure. It was almost impossible to enforce. Now, one of the most colorful figures in this movement is this lady here. Her name is Carrie Nation. Her husband died of alcoholism. And so Carrie Nation, that's her mission, is to get rid of alcohol. And Carrie Nation would go into bars and saloons with an axe, and she would swing the axe while she recited passages from the Bible about how sinful what they were doing was. And she would chop up the bar. And, the kegs back then were wooden kegs. They were not metal kegs like they are today. And she would break open the wooden kegs with the axe. And she's reciting Bible passages and stuff. And she'd get arrested. They'd take her axe. She'd get out. She'd go buy a new axe. And then she'd go find another bar. Very, very colorful lady. All right. Another movement that comes up during this time is the social gospel movement. This is a religious movement. It's believed that a lot of problems in American society, child labor and economic inequality, crime, alcoholism, all these problems in American society could all be solved if we just turned and dedicated ourselves to Protestant Christian values. Okay. Some of the leaders in this were Washington Gladden, Charles Sheldon. They believed that if we just did good deeds pave the path to heaven. This guy, Walter Rauschenbusch, did not like capitalism. He thought capitalism was unchristian. And it began to take away a lot of the humanity from humans. He believed that capitalism turned us more into wild animals than human beings. He said one of the things that separates human beings from, say, a tiger or a lion is that human beings have compassion, especially for those who are less fortunate or not as capable as some of us. He said that's what made us humans. He goes, you look at a hungry lion and he sees a pack of gazelles going across, the savannah in Africa. And the lion's watching the gazelles and he sees a gazelle that's hurt, it's wounded, it's obviously not doing well. That's the gazelle the lion's going to go eat. And he said that's what capitalism does to people, is that people, businesses will take advantage of the weak, and they prey on the weak, and they prey on the less fortunate so that they can make money. So he advocates for what he calls Christian socialism. Have socialism, bring in socialism, get rid of capitalism, but have it based on Christian values. Now, out of the social gospel movement, there's a number of organizations that come about hoping to apply Christian values in Protestant Christianity to solve and address a lot of the social problems. A lot of these organizations you guys know of today. The Salvation Army, right? They are the army of God, and they're paving the way for salvation by doing good deeds. Salvation Army are the people out in front of like King Stupids ring-a-ding-ing the bell at Christmas time for you to drop money into their pot. The YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association, was another organization that came about. They would go into these poor, underdeveloped neighborhoods with immigrants and so on, and they would set up recreation centers and have the young men come in and work out and play basketball or baseball or whatever. And in doing so, they would preach the gospel, preach Christianity to them to try to convert them to Christianity. And again, they believed they're paving the way to heaven by doing good deeds. Racial problems begin to get addressed during this time. And, racial problems, civil rights has been this recurring theme throughout American history. Sometimes it's really important. Other times it kind of falls off and then it comes back and it's just important again. This is one of the times when focus on civil rights really, really becomes a big focus. In the progressive movement, we see a lot of changes in civil rights. It kind of kicked off with a big court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, Plessy was a man whose father was black, mother was white. And so he's a mixed race, and he gets onto a train, but he goes to the white car, right? There's the white car and there's the black car. And he goes to the white car. Well, they tell him, you got to go to the black car. And he goes, well, I'm not black. My father was white. And they said, oh, no. If one of your parents is black, you're black, right? There's no, you're not a mixed race. You're black, right? And you got to go to the black car. And he goes, well, I don't want to go to the black car. Black car, the white car has some really nice things that a black car doesn't have, like seats and heat and windows and things like that. So he gets arrested. He sues. It goes to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court rules that segregation is okay. You can separate the races as long as it's separate but equal, meaning you can segregate them as long as the things that you give them are equal to the whites. So their ruling was, look, there was a white car, there was a black car. They're separate. It's part of the same train. They're going to arrive wherever they're going at the same time. So that's equal. You can separate them, same train, same place, it's equal, even though the black car was not anywhere near as nice as the white car. And this is where we begin to get segregated bathrooms, white bathrooms, black bathrooms, white drinking fountains, black drinking fountains, white schools, black schools, right? Separate but equal. And this begins to get applied not only to African-American populations, but also in other areas where there wasn't a very large African-American population, but there was a fairly large minority population. Places like the American Southwest, Colorado. Not a lot of African-Americans living in Colorado at that time, but we do have a very large Mexican population. And you get the same thing. There's white drinking fountains, Mexican drinking fountains, white bathrooms, Mexican bathrooms, white schools, Mexican schools. So out of that court ruling come several African-American organizations, and they start organizations to promote and fight for civil rights. The largest of these is the NAACP, still around today. NAACP stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was the accepted term back then. It's certainly not the accepted term today. Don't use that term. But that's still an organization that's still around today. We get the emergence of some major civil rights leaders. And they have very different views about how to achieve civil rights for African Americans. First one is Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington believes that the best way to achieve equality for African Americans, for all minorities, is to take jobs that are readily available to them, right? So these are mostly low, menial, hard labor jobs. Those are jobs that African Americans and other minorities could get. He said, so let's take those jobs and prove that we can do these jobs just as good as whites. And that'll begin our march slowly up the social ladder. Okay. He starts a school, like a trade school, like a Warren Tech kind of. called Tuskegee Institute, still around today. It's now Tuskegee University, and the goal of the school was to teach African Americans to be the very best farmers or carpenters or ditch diggers or whatever that they could be, so they could prove that they're really good at this and begin this march up the social ladder. Okay? He's known as an accommodationist, meaning that he's going to take what's available and work with it, right? Booker T. Washington will be the first African American to be invited to dinner at the White House. Teddy Roosevelt is the one who invites Booker T. Washington. And then there's a guy who has a complete opposite view of how to do this. His name is W.E.B. Du Bois. And W.E.B. Du Bois is going to take a different approach. He sees political equality as more important than economic equality, right? He thinks it's important that they have African Americans have an equal standing in society rather than an equal standing in the economy. Okay? And he wants African Americans to start at the top of the social pyramid. So they to be doctors and lawyers and engineers and things like that, and prove that they could be just as good at doctors or lawyers or whatever as whites could be. Okay? And he wants what he called the talented 10th to go get an education. The most talented, most intelligent 10% of the African American population said you owe it to everybody to go and get a high-level education and go in and start at the top of the social pyramid, at the top of the social ladder, and prove we can be just as good as doctors and lawyers as whites can. And then it's easier to fill down from the social pyramid. W.E.B. Du Bois is the first African American to graduate from a Harvard, from a Ivy League school. W. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington don't get along with each other. They have very different views, right? And they can be a really good comparison contrast to modern day civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Malcolm X would be a pretty good comparison with W.B. Du Bois. Martin Luther King would be a very good comparison with Booker T. Washington. All right, another thing that the progressives addressed was women's health. This lady here, Margaret Sanger, believed that women should have access to birth control information. And she would go out and she'd distribute birth control information, pamphlets and devices and so on and so forth. And she would be arrested. She was arrested many times for violating obscenity laws and for distributing lewd pornographic literature, they called it. So she was arrested many times. She begins a women's clinic specifically for women's health, Planned Parenthood, still around today. Now, not all progressives had noble intentions. And Margaret Sanger would probably be one of these people. She was very worried about birth control, specifically because of immigrants. She was very alarmed that immigrants and poor people tended to have a lot more kids than did, quote unquote, Americans, middle class, upper class Americans had. And she was worried that eventually immigrants and poor would outbreed Americans and they would take over the country. So she wanted to keep that from happening. So she would go into very poor immigrant neighborhoods and distribute her information, trying to keep them from having a lot of kids. She's what's known as a eugenist, meaning that she believed you could breed out bad genes, that you could create a more perfect person by not allowing certain people to have kids, right? The most famous eugenist would be Adolf Hitler. All right. Next couple are not quite as exciting, but sometimes you got to deal with that. A couple of other reforms. U.S. senators were appointed by state legislatures. State constitution said politicians in the United States Senate would be sent there by the state legislature. The state legislature would vote who's going to be their U.S. senator. Well, you have this rise of what are known as party machines and party bosses. And they were very, very corrupt, and they controlled who got elected, right? They controlled everything. And it's a very, very corrupt process, these party machines and party bosses. They would control who got contracts to build sidewalks and so on. And they also controlled who got elected. And if you want to get elected, you had to play by their rules. And so what's happening is party bosses and these political machines are controlling who's going to the United States Senate. So the United States Senate is voting to keep these party machines and bosses, these very corrupt organizations, in power. So the 17th Amendment is passed in 1913, and that changes the Constitution. So no longer do states' legislatures choose U.S. senators, but U.S. American citizens choose who their senator will be. And just recently, we had an election this past November and chose a new U.S. senator. The people of Colorado did, and they sent John Hickenlooper to the Senate. In the past, it would have been the state legislature that decided that. Not real exciting, but it's a very important change. Another important change, the Progressive Era brings about primary election, where voters are going to choose who they want to be their candidate for U.S. Senate, for House of Representatives, for governor of their state, for president of the United States. Before this was all done, this would be selected by the party machine. The party bosses would choose who your candidate is. Now we get primary elections where the voters, the citizens, will get to choose who their candidates will be. Okay? So it gives voters the chance to choose the candidate they want to run for office. Okay? Like I said, before this was a very corrupt process. It was whoever bribed the party bosses the most, they would become the candidate. And voters had very, very little choice. Citizens had very little choice or input on who got chosen. And we now have primary elections for local elections, for state elections, and obviously for national elections. Again, not very exciting, but very important. All right. Progressive era also brings about a lot of laws to try to stop the growth of industry and the power of industry. One of the first one of these, an attempt to break up monopoly, was the Sherman Antitrust Act. And this gives the government to outlaw or at least control a lot of monopolies where, this industry, this company or whatever, gets to dominate, gets to control this entire industry. Like Carnegie Steel or Standard Oil, right? They controlled that entire industry, those one companies. This law allows the government to control that. However, the Sherman Antitrust Act to control monopolies was originally written by wealthy industrialists, the monopolies themselves. Why would they write a law against themselves? It wasn't against themselves. They wrote a law to try to get the government to stop and break up unions because these wealthy industrialists, Andrew Carnegie and Rockefeller and those guys, they argued that unions had a monopoly on labor. And if the unions told the workers to stop working, workers stopped working, and they didn't make any money. So that was the original intent of the Sherman Antitrust Act. When Teddy Roosevelt becomes president, he's going to begin to apply the Sherman Antitrust Act, not against unions necessarily, but against Standard Oil. In 1914, we get a much stronger antitrust law called the Clayton Antitrust Act, which effectively outlaws all monopolies. No longer can one industry dominate and control an entire industry. Around this time, a lot of progressives begin to call themselves the populists. And the populists were mostly agrarian, farming, Western people who felt like they were being used and abused by wealthy Eastern industrialists. And they create a populist party that wants to reform a lot of things. And so you begin to hear a lot about populists and a lot about progressives. They have very similar ideals. One of the big goals of the Populist Party was to control the railroads. Farmers depended on railroads to take their products back east to where the people lived. And the railroads knew that, and they took a lot advantage of farmers a lot. They would charge them exorbitant rates, just crazy, crazy rates to ship their products back east. And there wasn't much the farmers could do about it. So they want the government to control the railroads. So you get the Interstate Commerce Act, which is passed in 1887 during the Progressive era. And this gives the government the ability to regulate railroads, any business that takes place between states, like from Wyoming to Nebraska to Iowa to wherever. The government gets to control and regulate the railroads there. So the shipping costs have to be clear and consistent. They can't change from day to day, which was what would happen. Railroads would tell farmers one day, oh yeah, we'll ship your corn, a ton of corn or whatever. We'll ship your corn back east for this price. Next day, the farmer would show up with all his corn, and all of a sudden it was an entirely different price. This law says railroads can't do that any longer. Okay? It says that all costs must be reasonable and just. You can't charge crazy prices because you want to. Okay? Prices have to be reasonable, and you have to be able to justify why you're charging that price. And then they banned rebates and pooling prices, which is railroads very often would give a friend of theirs a very cheap price to ship their product, and then they would make up whatever money they were losing on that cheap price. They would make it up by charging more money to somebody else. Railroads can't do that anymore. This law is still around today. It involves not only railroads, but trucking and airplanes and any business that's conducted between the states. The government has the ability to control that. All right. This one is really important because it changes everything for everybody. One of the big things that the populist progressives wanted was to come up with a tax system that would begin to redistribute income. So you wouldn't have these super, super, super wealthy people and super, super, super poor people. And they get that with the passage of the 16th Amendment in 1913. And it gives the government the ability to tax income. According to the Constitution, when it was originally written, government can tax a lot of things, but one thing they couldn't tax was your paycheck. Now the government gets the ability to tax your income. You get an income tax. And it's a graduated income tax, meaning the more money you make, the more money you pay in taxes. The less money you make, the less money you're going to pay in taxes. And the idea was this will begin to close the income cap, right? Because if you're making a lot of money, you're going to pay more in taxes, which is going to begin to lower your total wealth. And the less money you make, the less you pay in taxes, and it'll increase your income. Okay. Also gives the government more money. This gives the government more money to fund different social programs, right? Food stamps, welfare, things like that. This gives the money to the government so they can begin to do these things, which accomplishes a lot of their goals as well, the progressive goals as well. All right. And then, big one, huge one. It affects half of our population. The 19th Amendment is passed in 1919. Women, for the first time, are allowed to vote. Yay! Women have been fighting for this for over 100 years. Women had been pushing and pushing for the right to vote. Okay? And remember, women tied their plight into abolitionism early on. They said, we're just like slaves. We don't have any rights in society. And then slaves get freed, and then slaves get to, at least former slave men get the right to vote. Women went, hold on a second, right? We've been citizens forever, and now they get a right to vote. And so this gives women 19th Amendment give women a right to vote for the first time. Now, in several Western states, women have been allowed to vote in state and local elections for a long time. Wyoming was the first state, gives women the right to vote. Then Colorado as the second state, Nebraska, Kansas, Utah, all give women the right to vote early on. Now, the reason was not because they're great women suffragists, champions of women voting. Oh, nay, nay. They did it because they wanted women to move out there because they had a lot of men. And men are incredibly unstable people. And men tend to move around all the time, especially back then. They'd move around for this job or that job or this gold strike, that gold strike. So you had these boom towns, and then all of a sudden it became a ghost town as the men left. So these Western states begin to pass laws to allow women to vote because there's a lot of women back east, Philadelphia, New York, a place like that are pushing for women to have the right to vote. They're not getting it. So Western states thought, well, maybe if we give women a right to vote, we'll begin to attract women to our states. And women come to the states, they'll meet the men. The men will, fall in love or whatever, and then they'll begin to have kids. And now it becomes a lot harder for men to just pick up and move because now they got a woman and they got a kid and so on and so forth. And hopefully that'll stabilize our populations. That's why they passed a law. And it worked. Women came out, men met them, men had families, and all of a sudden it becomes really hard for men to move. And the populations in these Western states begins to stabilize as you don't get these boom and bust towns. They didn't want women to vote. They just wanted to give women the right to vote to attract women to come out. Okay. Now, women argue that they need the right to vote because they understand what's best for the health and well-being of their family, as well as protecting their children. Child labor laws, right? They say that men don't get that, men don't understand it because men are always working, men are always at the office, men are always, involved in money stuff, and they don't really know the needs of the family and the home, and women do. And so women needed a right to vote. Okay. Some of the early leaders in this movement are Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Alice Paul, and they would show up to vote very often. They'd get arrested, and, so on and so forth. So women lose the ability, or women gain the ability, to vote. 19th Amendment. Yay! How exciting is that? And we're done. Whew, I know that was a lot, but there was a lot that happens during this time, and it was important stuff. All right, make sure you guys turn your notes in, and we'll see you next time.